Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Community and Youth Organizing series. My name is Sarah Zeller-Berkman, and I'm the Director of Youth Studies Programs here at CUNY School of Professional Studies. I always love this speaker series that we have in conjunction with our Community and Youth Organizing class in the master's program at CUNY SPS, but this year it feels especially important, and today it feels especially important. We saw the power of good organizing in Georgia this morning. We're seeing kind of the, white privilege at its height, the epitome, as Trump supporters can storm our Capitol with very little resistance, while Black Lives Matter protesters were repressed violently over the summer. And so I'm so excited today to get into these conversations with the panelists about, how state power is wielded in defense of white supremacy. And this is a context in which this conversation sits, right? And so we're so privileged to have Professor Bandelli, who is the curator of this series, who is the professor of the Community and Youth Organizing course in our program. And in addition to being a seasoned educator, he has decades and decades of experience as an organizer and deep connections to these movements, deep connections to the people doing this work. So I'm gonna pass it over to you, Professor, to start us off. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us on this day. And what a day it is. What a day it is. My name is Lumumba Bandelli. I'm an organizer with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement and an adjunct lecturer at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. I'll be facilitating this speaker series, and I am honored to be able to present to you this series. Today we will be discussing defund and reimagining public safety. Next week we'll be talking about the ever so timely issue of democracy, the fragility of democracy, and the flaws and challenges of the electoral process. And then the following week we will close with a discussion on racial capitalism. But for today, we are witnessing some unprecedented activities. We are witnessing something that if we were to see in other parts of the world, it would be called what it actually is, an attempted coup. In fact, we would be witnessing calls from this government to restore democracy, to restore order. But here we have, and somehow Malcolm's context of a particular moment in history of the chickens coming home to roost fits today. It fits today. And so we're going to talk about some of the realities of what we have witnessed and how it plays into policing, how it plays into our overall understanding and concepts of safety, of security. And we're going to talk about what I know much has been intentionally in some cases misinterpreted, in other cases just misunderstood, the idea of defund and what the defund campaign looks like. I'm honored to be joined by three amazing organizers that I have the privilege of calling friends and comrades. We are joined by Mark Anthony Johnson, who is an organizer out of LA Wellness Center and the Dignity and Power campaign. And he'll be talking about some of the amazing work and victories that they have accomplished in Los Angeles. We're also joined by my homegirl, another Brooklyn native, the amazing Antonine Pierre from the Brooklyn Movement Center, who will be talking about the work of BMC, not only within Communities United for Police Reform, but standalone, the work that they have been doing around New York City's defund work. And then finally, we also have Brother Trey Murphy, who is an organizer with Organizing Black and also the Deputy Director of Community Organizing at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And so we're going to attempt today to put in context some of what is happening around the world and talk about just the evolution of how we got where we are. But we're going to start off really with a conversation with Mark Anthony Johnson. And I don't want to spend too much time doing a introduction and bio. People have been able to look at and see his bio on the website. And so I welcome you all to learn more about him and view more of his history there. But I don't want to take any time away from him. But Mark Anthony is one of the leaders in the movement for Black Lives. He's been leading the work around the criminal justice reform stuff, closing jails in Los Angeles, and has been helping provide leadership for a lot of the national work. So I want to turn it over to you, Mark Anthony, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Y'all can hear me? I'm good?
I hear you fine.
Awesome. Really happy to be here tonight. Really excited to be here with this dope panel and excited to be here with y'all. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about our work at Justice LA. I have been doing community organizing in Los Angeles for the last 20 years. And this is my home. This is the place that I know best. And this campaign has been a decade of that work. It took us roughly 9 years to actually stop the jail. And then that fight continues as there are multiple campaigns that make up Justice LA on the implementation side of some pretty significant and surreal defund wins that we're in right now. And so I actually want to introduce you to Justice LA by sharing a video. I'm gonna share my screen, make sure my sound is correct. Hang on, give me a second here, I wanna go to, let's see here. So I'm just pulling it up right now. Okay, so we should be good here. And this is a video that we do just to introduce folks to kind of what the campaign is. Great.
Their new jail planning. It's important. Today we're here preparing for our action that we having to let them know that we still not for their new jail planning. It's important that we be strategic and make sure that our message doesn't get out, so one, that it doesn't be blocked off when we try to get there, but also so that people feel safe and know what's going on, so that just in case something does happen, it doesn't get chaotic.
We're out here today delivering 100 beds to the County Board of Supervisors, specifically to talk about their jail expansion plan, $3.5 billion to go into caging our loved ones.
This county is trying to invest in over 3,000 jail beds. And what we're saying is that that money could be used elsewhere.
LA County is the biggest jail in the world, the biggest jail system, and we do not need more jails. We need to deal with these symptoms of issues. We need to stop criminalizing poverty. We need to stop criminalizing mental illness.
So what you saw was the introduction to Justice LA which was in fact our launching action. So we actually we kicked this off in 2017, and we started with an action. This was post 2016. I'm going to try and review some of this in terms of how we got to the place that we're at, where we actually had a major loss in that decade-long fight, where a major hurdle was cleared to move forward with this $4 billion jail plan. And we made a decision that if we were going to really win an abolitionist fight against the jails, we had to actually broaden the coalition. And Justice LA was a reformation of a group of folks who have held down that jail fight, including myself and several other key organizers who have pulled that together, led by Patrice Cullors, who really pulled us together to say, look, we have to revamp how we're doing this and help people in LA understand that a $4 billion mental health jail is actually contradictory to any other aspect of life we're trying to advance in Los Angeles County. And so we actually kicked off with an action in front of our County Board of Supervisors in 2017, September, which is what you saw, where we unloaded 100 jail beds that we had hired a formerly incarcerated artist to weld together and to actually shut down the street in front of the County Board of Supervisors, announcing that we were committed to continuing the fight to stop that jail. We then, from that moment, actually dispersed those jail beds across the county and recruited folks in the community, artists in the community, to actually reimagine them, to take control of them and say, look, you can redesign this jail bed into whatever you like, and we're going to drop it somewhere publicly to start to build the political consciousness and start to test whether folks would be willing to engage in that reimagining process. And it was a phenomenal project. You can actually go to Justice LA now. And we actually have a map where you can see where we dropped off the jail beds. And folks really took it to heart and reimagined and turned those steel beds into everything from altars to recovery sites to knitting stations to all types of things. And the goal was to really kind of build the political consciousness around that reimagination. And so I'm going to walk you through a series of slides that kind of explain some of the things that we were doing and how we got to where we were and where we are now. I will share my screen again. So, as I said, Justice LA is a coalition. It's held together by an executive team of about 11 organizations, majority Black-led, majority folks who are impacted, both who had been incarcerated themselves, but also who had loved ones who are incarcerated. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was share with folks and really help folks understand that if we were going to win this fight, we had to really get at the heart of the political dissonance that existed in the county. And so I want to take a little bit to talk about what that meant. First of all, just some really brief context. Black folks are 8% of LA County's population generally, but 30% of the county jail and 43% of the county jail's serious mental health disabilities population. It's essentially the largest jail system in the world, has the largest mental health quote unquote treatment facility in the country, that being Twin Towers Jail, which is roughly 4,000 beds. The mental health population in jail was roughly 6,000. It's currently at that point right now, even as we move towards winning some really successful diversion efforts. Our County Board of Supervisors are the decision makers. We are a county of 11 million people, divided up amongst 5 county seats. Those supervisors control roughly 2 million votes, counties that are huge and county districts that are huge. And our budget for the county is several $billion. We have the largest sheriff's department in the country. Our sheriff's department runs custody and patrol. So they are the folks arresting us, brutalizing us, profiling us, and they are the folks who, once we are taken to jail, are also the folks doing the custody work as well, which is also a tremendous site of brutality, torture, and a lot of human rights violations. Our sheriff is elected, which means there's very few checks and balances outside of the ballot box. And then a couple things that have happened in 2011, the state of California forced the prison system to reduce its jail population significantly because of overcrowding, which meant that thousands of folks were sent to local counties, which it ballooned our local jail population. We tried to address that via Prop 47 in 2014, which changed about between 6 and 9 felonies to misdemeanors and resulted in a huge shift in the jail population. So the jail population dropped from about 20,000 people in our LA County population in 2014 to roughly 16,000. And so where we're at now is, where we were at is we really wanted to articulate for folks what was the issue, right? The issue was that we were about to spend billions on incarceration, violence, criminalization of things we considered public health issues, and our priorities were certainly out of whack. And this is a report we did that showed that. And we said, look, for every dollar that the Department of Probation and sheriffs get, Department of Mental Health gets 56 cents, affordable housing programs get 1 cent, Department of Workforce Development gets 3 cents, and the homeless and housing programs get about 2 cents. And given that our jail population was made up of significant populations of people with mental health disabilities, significant houselessness population, it showed very clearly that the priorities were in the wrong place. And so we started from that place, and we were up against a pretty comprehensive plan. Actually, the plan was to build 2 jails. It was to tear down Men's Central Jail, but first the goal was to build a new women's jail, and to move people who are housed in that women's jail to that new facility in a place called Lancaster, which is 3 hours away from where I lived at the time, but was still LA County. And then move people housed in Men's Central Jail to the old women's facility, tear down Men's Central Jail, and build what they called a consolidated correctional treatment facility, a mental health jail. It's roughly 3,800 beds at the cost of $4 billion. The political dissonance we're up against was such that everybody agreed that the worst place for people to be who have mental health disabilities was a jail. This is our sheriff at the time who said, look, when you think about a jail environment, it is literally the worst place to house someone or attempt to treat someone who has a mental health disability. And yet the county board of supervisors, the district attorney, the sheriffs were full force moving ahead and said there was nothing we could do about it. Part of what contributed to that, and again, we're still in this context phase, is we had been fighting this for several years. And one of the things that really struck me and was one of the devastating blows that we had was a health consultant was brought in to assess whether or not we could close jails, whether or not we needed to build a jail, and how could we address the crisis of warehousing people with mental health conditions. That health associate put forward an analysis using partially some of the data you see here, which is that our mental health population in our jails was going to grow, was going to double between then and 2035. Our problem with that analysis, I think, was pretty obvious. If there's a problematic pattern of that type of growth, then let's disrupt the pattern rather than creating more space for the pattern to continue. The unfortunate reality was the Board of Supervisors did not feel like there was enough diversion capacity to actually make that happen. And so my work then became organizing healthcare providers to join into this fight, because there was not any organized healthcare providers in our coalition at the time who could challenge the health narrative that was being used to justify jail construction. This is just a snippet of how some of the funds get used locally. This is 2012 to 2017 data. Our sheriff's department spends about 34 million people incarcerating people in Compton. That is an area that is 49% Black. In Los Angeles County, again, we are 8% of the county population. And when you look at why people are being incarcerated, the top reasons are things that we consider public health issues: possession of a narcotic, possession of a controlled substance, DUIs, driving with a suspended license, corporal injury to a spouse and cohabitant, burglary, things that we think that there are public health approaches, even when you consider violence. We believe that there are public health approaches that do not require police contact, let alone jails. And so that was our analysis moving forward. And we were able to stop it. We were able to stop it in January. And I just want to just call your attention to the date of this article. This is LA Times. February 13, 2019, we moved the county using a host of tactics and strategies to actually stop LA County from building the jail, with a commitment that they would build a hospital instead. This was a significant victory for us. Prior to this, on January 8th, we were able to actually stop the county from building the women's jail, which was the crux of the whole plan. And so we like to actually say we stopped 3 jails that year: a women's jail, the correctional treatment facility. I see you on time, Lumumba. Thank you for the time check. But then what we then found is that after February, there was a plan to create this hospital, and a document was leaked to us. This is a image from the document that showed that you see these 2,400 beds here on that top kind of section there. Those are jail beds that would be in the hospital. And so we quickly moved in August to challenge the construction contract, period. And we're actually able to move the county to stop and cancel the entire construction contract. Because what they did is they stopped the plan to build a mental health treatment jail, quote unquote, but kept the construction company contract. We forced them to cancel the entire contract. And at the same time, forced them into a place where they actually committed to developing a county-wide system for alternatives to incarceration. The point that I'll end on is that program of alternatives to incarceration was approved last year. It's 114 recommendations for how to stop arresting people in LA County and how to divert people out of the jails and out of police contact at every point in which you can move through the criminal justice system. In addition to that, what we did is we passed Measure J, which was approved last November by 57% of the electorate, which is roughly 2 million votes. Measure J secures 10% of the county's discretional funds. So these are not state or federal dollars. This is local revenue. It amounts to $1 billion a year that would be taken and secured for alternatives to incarceration and housing, and it's resources that in the actual charter change, in the language of the law of LA County, says that that $1 billion has to be in addition to anything that is already being spent on alternatives to incarceration, and it cannot be used by law enforcement. And so this was the most significant victory that we had that has moved us into a different phase, that not only did we stop the jail, we have won a framework and a map to build alternatives. And now we're able to pass Measure J with the majority of the electorate in Los Angeles County to actually fund those alternatives in perpetuity. So that's a little bit of a taste of what we've done. Would love to talk more about it. And I'm excited to hear from other folks about the great work that is happening around the country.
Thank you, Mark Anthony. And so Mark Anthony really gave us a really good framing for what defund actually looks like. When we are talking about it, we aren't talking simply about removing resources from criminal justice institutions, but we're talking about reallocation into human services for communities that we know help to impact what people call crime and other safety issues. Before we move on, I want to introduce a very quick video vignette that we at the Movement for Black Lives have been using this past summer. This summer, many people know that this was the uprising summer. New York Times had quantified that over 25 million people were activated in this summer between June and July. Between those 2 months alone, which is historic, that has never happened in this country. And one of the things that we were able to do was really capture not only the attention of community members around the world, around our country, but also help to frame why we were fighting. So I just wanted to introduce this particular video, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this has impacted the work, and then move to Antonine Pierre. So really quickly.
to be right or wrong, a song for those who try.
So that was an opportunity for us to really reframe what the Black resistance looked like and to share how and why we were in the streets. And so I want to shift right now to the amazing work of the Brooklyn Movement Center, which is one of the organizations that make up Communities United for Police Reform here in New York City, and introduce the amazing Antonine Pierre, who is the co-director at the Brooklyn Movement Center. And we want Antonine to talk a little bit about the defund work that has been happening in New York City, but also talk about some of the distinctions that make New York City what it is. You know, one of the things that we are known for in New York City is the unreal budget that our police department has. According to the Citizens Budget Committee in fiscal year 2020, this year, New York City's expenses for the NYPD will total $10.9 billion. That's billion with a B, right? And we know that we just came out of a defund fight where apparently we were told that the NYPD reduced their budget by $1 billion. And so we want Anthony to talk about some of the misinformation that came out of that, but the fight in general. And so welcome you, Anthony Pierre. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here. And Lumumba, thank you so much for that illustrious introduction. You keep calling me amazing. I'm going to have to start paying you. So thank you a lot. And thanks to all the panelists as well. And Mark Anthony, your presentation really, it's so great that the work that you all have done in particular around mental health. And, you know, I think that when people think about defund or you think about the police, you don't think about mental health, you don't think about schools, you don't think about hospitals or homeless shelters. And the reality is that the public consciousness around policing really exists around police shootings, right? Around killings of unarmed Black men is largely where the conversation is at. But if you're a Black person in America, you understand that like that is, you know, it's hard to say the worst because these are all terrible outcomes, but it's one of the worst outcomes. It's not the only outcome that can happen when you are when you're approached by police, right? And you know, our entry into this work did actually start around mental health. So back on April 4th, 2018, a young man named Saheed Vassell was killed by NYPD in Crown Heights. And Saheed was bipolar and his family struggled to get mental health services for him through the city. And he was having an episode at the time that he was approached by police, and police officers rolled up at 4:20 in the afternoon, and it was, they shot him within less than 30 seconds of exiting their car, right? And again, we understand that Black men there's a consciousness around the way that Black men are killed by police. And what's important if we're going to solve these problems is to start to parse out what are the different issues here, right? That like, it wasn't just that Saheed was walking around unarmed, it's that Saheed was having a mental health episode, and the people who were called to actually help him had guns, right? And so coming out of that work of supporting Saheed's family, Brooklyn Movement Center, as a part of Communities United for Police Reform. So CPR is a coalition. We're a member in the coalition. There are lots of members in this coalition. And our collective work was to say, look, we know that people who are having mental health issues are even more susceptible to police violence, because when you're having, and when I say mental health issues, I also want to clarify for folks, we often think about people who have diagnosed mental health issues. And the reality is that any of us are susceptible to having a mental health episode, right? Like you could get fired from your job and like spaz out in the street, right? And someone could call the cops on you, right? So when, you know, there's a way that if we're doing this work, we want to understand that we're not just talking about like a section of people who are outside of ourselves. We're actually talking about ourselves, our family members, our loved ones, and what everyday people are suffering. And within Communities United for Police Reform, we worked with other organizations, and I want to lift that up because we often, I think as organizers, we often think about like, okay, my organization is doing this and that, but our power does come not just from organizing a base in our organization, but like organizing the power of collective bases. And we worked within CPR for about 1.5 years, really just developing what does this campaign look like, right? Like, and what does it mean to take police out of being first responders to mental health issues? And, you know, it's funny because you can do all the policy work in the world and still come to a policy issue and be completely new and be, you know, and have to parse out, you know, we were trying to parse out like, what does 911 look like, right? Like the things that we understand we have a lived experience of, that to build a campaign, we have to parse out like, what are the policies, who makes decisions, what are the pressure points, right? Like what's our power analysis? So as we were developing this campaign and really figuring out like, what are the different pieces here? You know, I think the climate in the city was generally around co-responders. So saying that if someone calls 911 and there's a mental health issue, that police would respond along with mental health professionals. And we've seen situations like the killing of Kwame Amadou in October of 2018, only a few months after Saheed was killed. He died in police custody and in his own home, and police were there, mental health professionals were there, EMTs were there. And what we realize is that when police are around, they make this, just their presence makes the situation more unsafe. So as we developed our work, we were developing our campaign, and then boom, March 2020, a pandemic hit, right? And then, you know, we weren't in a position to start running a budget campaign. But that is what the conditions called for, right? Because we saw that social distancing was being criminalized, right? Like we saw that in the first 3 months of the pandemic, that the social distancing arrests in Brooklyn and also citywide were majority Black and brown folks, right? And so recognizing that, and also recognizing that Mayor de Blasio, a month into the pandemic, revised his budget to say that what we actually, to say that we needed to cut the New York City budget by $1 billion. And the cuts that he did were largely to the Department of Education, to summer youth employment, to the Department of Health, and only 1 million of that $1 billion cut was actually going to be out of the NYPD. So at that point, you know, ready or not, we had to get ready, and we had to put together a campaign that called for budget justice. And I say budget justice because we were like, they're not ready for defund, right? And we fashioned a campaign that was called hashtag NYC Budget Justice, and that was fashioned to the political climate, right? Like what is the power analysis of what in particular city council members were willing to call for to push back against the mayor. And this is the piece that I like best about the campaign, that we were working with the context. And then, as we know, at the end of May, when George Floyd was murdered, the context completely shifted, right? And it was literally people taking to the streets that actually gave us the backing, that gave us the power, that shifted the power and created a different analysis for us, that actually, one, the movement for Black Lives was calling for defund. Everyone was calling for defund, right? Like there was a context that was encouraging taking money out of policing. And that actually, you know, I'll talk about the city fight, but one thing that feels important to talk about is that in the first week of June, something really remarkable happened in New York State, which is that the New York State legislature, which had already recessed because of the pandemic, was called back in particular to deal with issues of policing at the state level. And that created a particular, you know, we often think about the city and the state work as separate, but we all live in New York, and we know that the state context influences the city context. So we were able to, by having some big wins at the state level, so repealing 50A, which is a law that, the police secrecy law that made it so that police officers' disciplinary records were shielded from the public, right? By passing bills at the state level, we actually picked up momentum to go into the city fight, right? And the deadline for the city budget fight was June 30th. So we spent we started with some good momentum in June. And as many of you know, defund in terms of communications, our communications became very complicated, right? Around the word defund, right? Because I will say that the folks who would like to preserve police power, the folks who would like to make it so that police continue to not be accountable for what they do to Black and brown communities, we're exploiting the fact that when people hear defund, they think, well, we're just gonna get rid of the police, right? And this is also what's so great about Mark Anthony's presentation, that LA is talking about funding alternatives, right? Like there's no, when we talk about policing and police accountability, we're really at a base level talking about community safety. We're talking about how do we keep people safe. We're talking about how, when we say that we're holding people accountable for doing harm, which is what is called crime, right? When we're holding people accountable, that we're actually creating more safety, right? And I think the issue with policing is that police actually cause more harm. So as we were in the middle of our defund work, I think some of this complication that started of, okay, people are having issues really understanding defund and understanding that we're not talking about getting rid of the police tomorrow. We're talking about moving money from policing into social services. That actually really gave us an understanding of where some of the gaps were, right? And as organizers, we want to dream big, we want to move forward. We don't want to talk about the gaps, right? And one thing, as we're moving into the next phase of defund, into like the 2022 budget cycle, we really want to be clear that, one, budgets are complicated, right? I think we want to lay out that the fact that the NYPD budget is $6 billion and the fact that the Department of Education budget was actually defunded at $1 billion last year, that is something that we want people to understand in ways that actually make sense for their everyday lives. And I think another piece is that, we want to recognize how much in the work that we did last June to actually defund the NYPD at $1 billion, that Black organizing is different from just organizing everybody, right? And when you're organizing Black people, you're around policing in particular, you're organizing folks who are directly affected. We do need to address the idea that police equals safety for many people, that we automatically think of safety, even if those aren't the outcomes, that there's a learning that we have. And I think in our movements, to build the kind of campaigns that we are building, we need leaders, right? Like it can't just be like a singular Antonin or a singular Mark Anthony or a singular Trey doing this work, and that the leadership development, you don't do leadership development in one moment, right? Like you don't do leadership development in a movement moment. BMC has been doing leadership development for over 10 years, right? And that means that in the moment that defund hit, we were able to call upon leadership. And if moving forward, if we want to continue to do this kind of work, we do need to be able to make sure that our organizing reaches not just into creating a base, and I'll wrap up because I know I'm at the end of my 12 minutes, but not just into creating a base, but into sort of that I want to say old school, but it's what we need to be doing right now, which is developing our base, building up our members, and building up our leaders so that we can have people who can actually move this work, and that, it's not the conversation that we're constantly having about organizers burning out, but that we're actually building our movement at the same time that we're building our campaigns. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Antonin. I appreciate it. Thanks much. I want to introduce just another video vignette before we bring up Trey Murphy. But I'm going to ask people who have questions to please write down your questions in the chat. We are going to engage you all in questions. And we're going to ask if they are actually questions. We're not going to ask for 4 or 5 other additional panelists. We're going to ask you to please submit questions. And so once we are done with Trey Murphy, then we will move to questions from you all. So please do that. Ryan, if you can help me, I want to cue up the other video and then we will proceed from there. Thank you. So as we move into our next panelist, Brother Trey Murphy, I first met, I believe it was 2015 in Baltimore after the murder of Freddie Gray. Trey is one of the leading organizers in the Baltimore area, but also right now is the deputy director at my old job, the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. So I'm going to ask Trey to join in the conversation and talk about the work that's been happening in Baltimore, both since the Freddie Gray murder, the work that's been happening in terms of trying to shift resources away. I know Baltimore's had a whole lot of changes I've gone through. I stopped counting in terms of the police leadership changes there, elected officials being arrested. I mean, a whole bunch of stuff. But if you can talk a little bit about the work that y'all been doing there. And then I want to tie it in after that with just a broader national analysis. If you can talk also about some of the civil rights organizations and how they have been shifting somewhat closer to where we want them to be in terms of the defund reallocation conversation.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Lumumba, for having me. Y'all didn't let me, am I talking on mute? No, I'm not. Okay, great. Y'all didn't let me know that this was going to be a dope panel like this. Like, I feel like I don't even really got to say anything else. We could probably go to questions, but you know, I'll do my best to chime in here. And I really love that Juneteenth Movement for Black Lives video. Like, I think that is the perfect piece to like chime in on, because there's so much encapsulates the work that we want to be up to, right? Like, I feel like my work as an organizer, as somebody who tries to like incubate social movements and social change, is to showcase the type of world that we're trying to build, right? And so the joy of people being in the streets, the joy of them demanding the world that they should be living in, is the exact work that we're trying to be up to, right? So I'm super excited to follow that video. It's one of my favorite videos. You may have saw me over here moving a little bit, so apologies for my lack of coordination. I'm gonna get it together. But as Lumumba said, I am the deputy director at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I won't talk a whole bunch about them because we're going to have a frank conversation around civil rights or traditional civil rights organizations and where they're at. But you all may know it was started by Thurgood Marshall. And it's one of the premier and leading civil rights organization, particularly law organizations that work on racial justice issues, and particularly back in the day helped to get Black people off of death row and like convictions of racist convictions that they was facing. But the thing that I am excited about, my political home, my baby, the thing that I co-founded is a small grassroots organization in Baltimore called Organizing Black, which is a membership-led organization fighting for Black liberation for all Black people in Baltimore through three core things. The first is building local power through transformative Black direct action. The second is political education. We believe that we have to be in the business of training up our folks. I think Anthony said that earlier. And so we wanna make sure that we're doing that. And the third is participatory governance practices, right? For us, it's not enough to just talk about what's messed up in our democracy. We also have to expand it so that the people who are most directly impacted by the issues are the ones who are actually in control of the powers, so that they can implement the solutions, because we know that they are the ones who are the experts in their own experiences. Therefore, they are the ones that can actually implement and write the solutions that we need in order to overturn some of these racist laws that have been meant to oppress Black people. I mean, at Organizing Black, our theory of change, or our theory is that Organizing Black is organizing us where dreaming meets action, right? So we believe that we sit at the intersections of dreaming and action. So it's not enough for us to just dream, we also have to move people to action. That was a long intro to get us to the defund work. So you all may know, similar to many others, that Baltimore is the home of Freddie Gray. It's the home of Tyrone West. It's the home of Anthony Anderson. It's the home of Corinne Gaines. It's the home of so many folks, right? So many folks, so many of our folks that have been lost because of a racist system that was never built to protect us, right? To protect Black people. And so since 2015, and I have been organizing since before then, but since 2015, a lot of things have changed inside the city. So some of the things that have changed is that community organizations are now beginning to have conversations around what does it mean to actually stand up community-based organizations so that they can be the providers, they can be the ones to actually implement some of the solutions that we've been talking about for years. What does it mean for them to be that alternative to the traditional carceral system that has encapsulated our city and honestly all of our dollars, right? And so that is the major change that we have seen. We have three pillars to our defund work in Baltimore. So the first is defunding to refund, right? So we believe that we need to take money from the police department because there are other community-based organizations that can do a lot more good with that money, that have been doing a lot more good for far less than what our police department has been doing, right? And we also believe that we have to approach the issues of quote unquote crime and violence from a public health perspective, right? And so for us, it's not enough to put money into a system that hasn't inherently worked in any way, shape, or form for our people. We have to begin to refund some of the systems that we know will actually get us out of this, out of the hole that we've dug ourselves in for the longest time. The second pillar is that we are defunding to dismantle. We are an abolitionist organization that's organized in Black, right? And we know that the system of policing, again, is inherently racist. We know that policing is reactionary. We know that we don't have oversight over our police. We know that they have a license to shoot and kill with extreme prejudice without any repercussions. We know that if there's an issue that happens inside of the Black community in Baltimore, we don't call the police first. We don't call the police first. We call our friends, we call our families, we call our neighbors. We call everybody else before we call the police, right? So knowing all of this, we begin to ask ourselves, why do we waste $500 million in Baltimore City on a system that isn't working in our best interest and that is not our first thought in the Black community as a Black city to be a adequate response? So we defund to dismantle. And then the third thing is that we do defund to revolutionize and reimagine, right? So if not police, then what, right? And for us, the what is already the organizations that are inside of our city, working inside of communities that have built the deep relationships inside of those neighborhoods, the ones who are already dealing with the shooters and the hitters, the people who are already on our streets every day, talking to folks and convincing them that there is a better way of doing conflict mediation, there is a better way of talking about issues, and frankly, that those same organizations or other organizations are oftentimes the ones that should have the funding for roles that police currently perform, such as dealing with sex work, such as dealing with homeless people, such as dealing with people with mental health issues, people who may have addiction problems. We have an entire, I would say, apparatus of organizations in the city already, right? And so our revolutionizing and reimagining solely exists on the premise that dollars should be going to those organizations who are already doing a lot more with a lot less, right? And so I'll just quickly go through a few other things. So who's working with us? We have a coalition in Baltimore. It's a multiracial, BIPOC-led coalition that spent years building alignment since 2015. It's called the Campaign for Justice, Safety, and Jobs. It was born out of the moment that was created by Freddie Gray's death, right? And it was not originally slated to last beyond a year, right? But 5-6 years later, we find ourselves now in this pivotal moment as the only checks and balance, coalition-related checks and balance to a police system and a carceral system in Baltimore that would just waste a bunch of money and not be held accountable to the community. So we work in coalition with folks, and we have 4 overall goals. The first goal is that we want to shift $100 million starting off from the Baltimore City Police Department. The second is that we do want to create a $100 million pot of money that funds community-based organizations providing human services related programs. The third is that we want to build the infrastructure to stand up those community-based organizations. Oftentimes, we will create pots of money inside of the city, and we won't think about how the infrastructure that these community-based organizations is needed to be able to scale up to both handle that amount of money, but also capture it, because many of them do, like I said, a lot more with a lot less. So they're not used to all of the reports. They're not used to all of the audits, all of the financial things, all of the things that come along with receiving public and private dollars are things that they're not used to. And so we want to be intentional about being able to stand those community-based institutions up in their structures to be able to meet that moment. And some of them honestly will not be stood up because there are organizations who are clear that they work on a smaller scale, and that's why they're so effective, right? And we still want to make sure that they are funded adequately to be able to do the work that they're doing locally on a smaller scale. So there's a bit of nuance there. And then the fourth thing is that we are laying the groundwork for a regular citywide participatory budgeting process, right? So for us, it is important for Black people to control and own their own resources, right? And we want to be intentional about that. And so that's just important for us. Lumumba, how am I doing on time? 3 minutes, okay, perfect. So we have 5 main strategies for our divestment side of this work, right? Because we recognize that the biggest challenge is going to be getting that $100 million removed from the Baltimore City Police Department budget. So the 5 main strategies that we have, first, we're going to approach this from a community organizing approach that actually centers participatory governance in the foundation of the organizer, right? That builds power in Black communities. So we're not going to go in, although we have a bunch of great ideas, we're not going to go into this without having a full backing, a full percentage of the Black community endorsing exactly where this money should go, the strategies that we should take, the whole 9 yards, right? Making sure that there's authentic, genuine buy-in from communities on the foundation of this. So we're taking a robust community organizing approach that centers that participatory governance, particularly through people's movement assemblies. The second is that we are taking a direct lobbying strategy through a mayoral task force that reviews the Baltimore Police Department budget. Some of you may saw we have a new Black mayor in Baltimore City who by all accounts is a lot better than previous mayors, right? And it's also a personal friend of mine's, but it's clear that he has been in alignment with the Defund, working with City Council President last year before he ascended to the mayoral seat in December. And as City Council President, he actually led the charge in defunding our police department budget, which I'm going to get into a little bit down the line when I talk about the wins we've already gotten. And so he's committed to that mayoral task force that will study and ultimately do the official recommendation of where to cut the police department budget, hopefully by that $100 million. The third thing is that we're going to have an aggressive city council district strategy that focus on forcing city council members to shift funds from the mayor's proposed budget. We're not putting all of our eggs in one basket, right? So we may have a friendly administration, but we are clear that we have to build the power in and around him so that we can hold him accountable and hold his feet to the fire. And so that means that we also have to lobby and organize our city council members. The fourth thing is that we have to have an aggressive public education campaign that centers directly impacted stories, right? And talks about what sense making actually looks like when we talk about dollars and community safety. And what we already know to be true, like I said, is that our communities rarely call the police, right? And so we need to be able to center those stories, make sure that people understand and be able to visualize and be able to relate to the practices that they're already doing, which is calling alternatives to policing already. And then the fifth strategy is a good ground game around canvassing. And so we're going to be intentional, like I said, about being in communities and building power with community. So we do have 3 wins that we have already gotten. It's a momentum. Some of it was created by the George Floyd apparatus, and some of it was momentum and wins that we've gotten from just nearly a decade of like trying to organize around this issue in that city. The first one is that we got the Baltimore City Police Department cut by $22 million already, right? We're asking for $100 million on top of that $22 million. So I want to be clear about that. That will be a fight for the mayor to be clear that what we are asking for when we say $100 million is on top of the 22 that he's already fought to cut. So that's one win. The second is that we weakened our strong mayoral city in Baltimore City. Baltimore City in the state of Maryland has one of the strongest executive systems anywhere in the country. Our mayor is the only one traditionally that could propose a budget, and the city council had no power to shift funds around in the budget or amend. Members of the board, of the 5 board, including himself, right? And so while we didn't get that piece weakened, we did give city council the ability to shift money in the budget, right? And so we're going to be heavily relying on our strategy for them to make sure that that $100 million get defunded in case the mayor goes back on his commitment. And then the third thing again was the mayor's commitment to the task force, so that we can actually defund the work. And so I'm going to actually stop there and just say one anticipated challenge before I shift to the civil rights organizations. So we have been doing a bunch of power mapping, and one of the anticipated challenges that we are clear about is that the older Black community, as much as they understand systemic racism, feel safer when they see police, right? Or feel safer when they see somebody in a police uniform. And that's a challenge in Baltimore City, right? That has a huge older Black community. And so what we are doing, the conversations that we are beginning to have is with the older Black community to be able to dream together, to have a robust, particularly faith and church strategy, because many of our older Black communities go to church, to be able to meet them where they're at, right? And so we're clear about that. But what is exciting about this moment also is that people offer for probably the first time on a major scale, beginning to ask questions like, who keeps us safe, right? Which we know to be true is ourselves and our communities oftentimes. When a community rallies around any individual or family, it's one of the most powerful things. And so just ways that we're meeting this moment. And so lastly, but not least, the shift that's happening in civil rights organizations. Lumumba sort of alluded to this earlier. And again, I work for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I'll say it's both rewarding, but not without its challenges as somebody who comes from grassroots organizations. But the shifts that we are beginning to see happen was created by the moment that we find ourselves in, right? The fact that there is a new majority that is on the rise, right? So some of the shifts that are beginning to happen is that for the first time, traditional civil rights organizations like the Legal Defense Fund, like the National NAACP, like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, are beginning to have conversations about supporting defund work and talking about transforming public safety beyond just policing, right? That to me, that is, I would have never guessed in a million years if you would have told me even before the George Floyd stuff, if you would have told me, heck, probably even last month, if you would have told me that organizations, civil rights organizations, was going to sign on for a new paradigm of public safety, I would have told you that you're crazy, right? So that's one of the shifts. The second, really quickly, is that there's a new generation of leaders that is revolutionizing the work right now. And traditional civil rights organizations are following their lead, right? Traditional civil rights organizations have a tendency of wanting to be the ones in the room that is right, or the ones inside of the rooms that is the most visible. But we're seeing them take a step back and say, we are not the experts on this, right? You all are. And so therefore we need to follow your lead. And so that's the second major shift. And then a third major shift, which we saw on a micro scale, and I'm hoping to scale that up, and me and Lumumba constantly strategizes around this, is the commitment of resources for non-traditional strategies. What we also know to be true is that civil rights organizations sometimes get stuck in the 60s and the 50s and the 70s when it comes to that strategy, and their resources reflect that, right? Their resources oftentimes go to things like litigation, right? And like some sort of like non-committal communication strategy. But what we are beginning to see is that civil rights organizations are recognizing that legal organizations are only as effective as the laws that we have instituted, and what is legal isn't always what's right. And so therefore the law has limitations for these legal organizations, right? And Trump has the Trump administration has exposed that on a grand level, right? Where even when the law is on our side, it can still be blatantly ignored. And so legal civil rights organizations are recognizing that it's not enough to just fund these strategies. We have to fund other strategies like building power, and particularly working in local movement infrastructures, right? I have a philosophy that the work has to be local. And if the work isn't local, then we failed at our job, right? Because the greatest impact is going to be felt locally. So I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for a while. But
thank you. So we're going to pull you back in during the question and answer, but thank you for sharing that. I know we've thrown a lot at people, and I want to thank you all, first of all, for being on this call with everything that is happening. And before we shift to Q&A, I want to do a visioning exercise, and then I'm going to pitch one other question to the panel, and then then open it up for the floor. But when we're talking about defunding the police, when we're talking about reimagining public safety, all of these things are really framed in generations-long struggles to protect ourselves from state violence. None of what we are experiencing are new. If you talk to your grandparents, many of them had to do the same thing in terms of the speech that they got from their parents, or they have to give their children to make sure they can survive a police encounter. And so when we are having these campaigns to change that reality, we realize that we are coming up against a very significant fallacy that's always been there. So I want us to do a quick visioning exercise, if you can, so that we can just go into that discussion really quickly. First of all, take a minute and just breathe. All right, it's a lot happening. My mind is all over the place, and I'm sure everyone else's is. We have all kinds of things that are just, all over the place. So take a minute and just breathe, if you can. Just pause, center ourselves, take a few deep breaths. And then I want you to take a minute to think about, and when you do this, in order for us to really vision this, I'm gonna ask you to just join me in closing your eyes. I want you to think about a time, a moment, and hopefully there's more than one time, hopefully there's more than one moment, where you actually felt safe, where you felt loved, you felt comforted, You felt secure. You did not feel threatened. You felt like you were in a environment that was pleasant. I want you to think about that one moment. Pick one if there's more than one. Think about where it was. Think about who was around you. Think about what you were doing. Think about what other factors contributed to you feeling that good, safe, secure kind of feeling. Okay, so hopefully you have more than one. I'm going to ask you to open your eyes and then join me if you can, just in the chat, if you can write what this moment was for you. Where was it? And if you've done this exercise before, and I see some old class students of mine on here, bear with me. Thank you for doing it again. You know, this is an opportunity for us to really recenter ourselves on what safety looks like, right? On what our conditioning has informed us, right? So if you can just write in the chat, what was that moment of being safe, being secure? A public performance on the street in Harlem. All right. Alex Haley Farm. Okay. Keep them coming. Being home. Freedom School with a therapist, meditating, yes, at home with family, growing up with my great-grandparents in Jamaica, BSU in college, giving birth. Oh, wonderful. A bad movie night with friends and family, yes. Surrounded by family, birding in the park, traveling to Haiti with your partner, with loved ones, being in the presence of my chosen family. All of this is wonderful. Traveling to Calcutta, jumping into the swimming pool at 5 into my father's arms. These are absolutely wonderful. And this is why, one of the reasons why I love doing this exercise, because again, it allows us to really recognize and acknowledge what safety looks like and feels like. What you'll notice is that nowhere in here did anyone say being in the presence of police. Nowhere in here did we see anyone say being in the presence of security officers or my GAT, my Glock made me safe, right? So when we recognize in a very general, objective context, what keeps us safe, that allows us to reframe how we engage this broader conversation of what community safety actually looks like. There are a number of questions that people had asked around, well, what do you do in dynamics when you actually have to address a situation? One of the things that we recognize in the work that we do is that oftentimes our communities have models that answer those questions, right? Here in New York City, I work with an amazing organization, and some of my students who took my class before, those who are taking it, will have an opportunity, in fact, later this week to meet some of the organizers at Connect NYC. Connect NYC does amazing work around gender violence. One of the things that they do is train particularly men to intervene in gender violence, right? To make sure that we are not bystanders, to make sure that we have the ability to actually prevent violence like that, right? There's another organization out in Brownsville called Man Up Inc. These people do amazing work. They've been able to, and if you know Brownsville, for those of you who are from Brooklyn or New York, they've been able to last year establish a no deaths by gunshot trend for over one full calendar year by intervening in violence without the inclusion of law enforcement, without working with law enforcement, right? And so we recognize that we have the ability to really respond to some of these issues then that allows us to really question, well, then how else can we replace this need for law enforcement? Because what really is a big challenge for us, and everyone has said it, Trey has said it, Mark Anthony has said it, Antonine has said it, that one of the biggest challenges for us as folks who are doing this work is that our communities by generation to generation have really bought into this fallacy that police keep us safe. We know that is not true. That is proven to be false. So when you talk about defunding the police, of course, the natural question is, well, if not the police, then what? And once we begin to interrogate that question, that's where we begin to have some of the more valuable anecdotes and kind of recommendations and stuff. And so I want us to just really use that framing as we move into this next part of the dialogue. But before we do that, I wanted to shift and ask the panelists, if you can, to talk about what this particular incident today tells us and teaches us around policing within our communities, policing with other communities. What has this attempted coup on the state capitol, and let's call it for what it is, this attempted coup on the state capitol, tell us? What does that inform this broader conversation around defund, around policing? What does that mean? How do we explain that to our communities and those outside of our communities? And I'll just, popcorn, anybody can take that.
Yeah, I'll give a brief response. You all can also jump in. Yeah, I think what happened today with this attempted coup, I'm so glad that you're naming it for what it is, Lumumba, and we have to also name the race dynamic, right? Like, we have white supremacists who seemingly have been in some kind of communication with law enforcement at the Capitol, right? Like, because they seemingly been in some kind of communication. It seems pretty clear that security was lax at the Capitol. We have a president who's been kind of seeding a conversation about the vice president needs to do something today, right? So, white supremacists are operating in plain sight. They're not wearing masks. They're leaving notes, right? Like, they're kind of wilding out and like, one white woman was killed by a police officer, and we know just from the experience of Black people who are just trying to buy Skittles and go to work and do whatever they need to do, that if any of these people if this had been a group of people of color, and specifically Black people, that the backlash would have been a lot more bloodshed. So this is just a prime example of the fact that when we look at what is happening in this country, white people are angry that Black people are being treated as human beings, that people are recognizing that Black people should have human rights as human beings. And there are these white people will kill other white people just to maintain white supremacy. So if anybody thinks that this is about policing, that's cool. But at the end of the day, this is actually about the tools that white supremacy uses to maintain itself.
Thank you. Trey, you were gonna?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that was like a really beautiful framing. The only thing that I would add on to that, particularly just so that like people can visualize it, it is interesting to me, and I made this post earlier, that you have a number of federal agencies, all 51 of DC's police departments. I know it's not really 51, but it's, nearly a dozen DC police departments, the National Guard, just like a wealth of concentrated law enforcement that exists in DC. And yet still, the Capitol building was able to be breached today, right? And I frame that way to also say, over the summer, like not even 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, not a year ago, over the summer, there was protests that happened in DC as a result of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and the shooting of Jacob Blake, and so many others, right, who did not make national news. But all of those, there was protests in response to that. And what we saw was armed guards on the steps of the Capitol, right, shooting tear gas at our folks, right, shooting rubber bullets at our folks. And it infuriates me that we still have a conversation around, quote unquote, the tale of two Americas, right? I would venture to say it's just America, right? Like, I don't even think that it's the tale of two Americas. This has been the way America has operated, and it further exposes the need for why law enforcement, particularly in Black communities, don't need to exist, right? But I think across the board, because they are inherently there to uphold a status quo that rewards white supremacy and the white elite over and at the expense, particularly of poor, Black, and working class people.
Thank you. Mark Anthony, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what Antoinine and Trey Murphy said. I mean, I think continuing to call it what it is, it's white political terror, right? I mean, that's essentially what these folks are trying to do. It's organized white supremacists, armed white supremacists, trying to interrupt the political process, and breaking the law to do so. And I think so we continue to name what it is, at the same time critiquing the infrastructure that exists to hold those folks accountable, because that infrastructure is the same infrastructure that's going to come down harder on us, right? And so, which I think for me validates the defund work so much more, right? Which is why we need a different force. When you see the law enforcement that were there in whatever capacity, treating those folks gently compared to how our folks have been treated. And we can cite, as folks have named, case after case after case. I think about Miriam Casey, who a Black woman whose car ran her car into a barricade at the Capitol and was shot 5 times in the back. And so, you know, I think we know what this is about. And so, again, call it what it is and continue to critique the process and infrastructure that exists, which is why we continue to need to defund, right? And obviously it's not surprising. I mean, you know, this is true for every law enforcement jurisdiction, but I come from LA, where the sheriff who ran our jails for years and encouraged his deputies to brutalize and torture people brandished a neo-Nazi tattoo, and was only ousted 3 or 4 years ago. And so, you know, he's one expression of a very deep collusion between white supremacy and state power, and this is what that looks like.
Can I, Lumumba, can I add just one small thing?
Sure.
Yeah, I guess we think about the law as if it's something natural, but it's actually something that people have created, which means it's something that people can break. And like, the laws in this country will only exist as long as there's a will to keep them. And, you know, in the movement, we try to make the laws for the people. And, you know, what we saw today is some folks trying to make some laws for their own selves.
Thank you. So we're going to open up the floor for questions. I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Sarah Zilla, to help us
we have
questions.
Yep, we have a bunch of different questions here. Let's start out with how are public health officials actually receiving the work being done? So many people alluded to kind of a public health approach. How are public health officials productively contributing to the reimagining of crime as a public health concern? And then someone added on, and the same with psychologists. How are they contributing or not to the movement?
Got it. Thank you. And y'all, who wants to take that one?
I can start. So, I mean, I mentioned earlier that part of the reason my particular organization started, the Frontline Wellness Network, was because there was a lack of organized healthcare providers in Los Angeles County who were actively resisting the notion that a health frame should be used to validate jail construction, and weren't present to critique the idea that a mental health jail was something that was actually possible, right? It's clearly an oxymoron. And part of what we built and what we understood is that the health arena is an arena of struggle. And that as we were building the Justice LA Coalition, we had to actually build what we identified as strategic flanks, folks who are not directly impacted, but had a political investment, an interest, theoretically at least, in this jail not being built. And so prior to us starting Justice LA, there was a cynicism that nothing could be done about these jails. And yet once a vehicle was created, the Frontline Wellness Network, which is a network of healthcare providers who is actively working to end the public health crisis of incarceration and criminalization. And once that vehicle was created, people said, okay, I get it. Like, I see how pretrial detention exacerbates every single health mission or concern you might care about: mental health, hypertension, anxiety, depression, trauma, pick something, reproductive rights. It undermines all of those things. And so we made an active move to organize both doctors, nurses, folks who work in the jails as healthcare providers, as folks who work in the communities. I'm grateful to say that it's been a successful experiment, and it's been not without flaws and not without challenges. But one of the things that was really important is that because we were so successful at mobilizing healthcare providers across the counties, and one of the things that we did is we identified the 3 most progressive board of supervisors who we believed were most likely to vote against the mental health jail, and organized within the major medical schools in their districts. And built bases in those medical schools who were training those folks. And because we were so successful, the leadership of the public health department and the Department of Health Services felt like they had cover, and felt like they actually could come out and say no, publicly saying, we don't actually need to build a jail. If we just build diversion capacity, we could actually tear down Men's Central Jail, which is the largest jail in our county, and focus on expanding bed capacity for crises and things like that, which is part of what has moved us into this place. And so it is not a given that they will stay on that track. The political project is to continue to build the base that can keep them on that track. But I would say that we needed to understand that the political leadership of the health departments had a vested interest and needed to stand in direct opposition to the sheriff's department. And that took building a political climate and building a base that could push them to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Sarah, you want to read the next one?
Yeah. So another person was saying that, there was this conversation about defunding and investing that in communities and CBOs. So the question is, how are CBOs, particularly those who may benefit from defunding, being held accountable for racial bias that they may currently have?
Yeah, I would want to be clear that the defund work that we're doing is actually not to invest money directly into community-based organizations. It's to invest money into city agencies besides the NYPD. And, and the way that city agencies work, often they will contract with community-based organizations to do certain kinds of work. But what feels really important here is that starting, I would say, in the late 70s and the 80s, and maybe even before then, the way that the nonprofit industrial complex has actually made nonprofits do the work that governments have been doing, like, that's not something that we want to perpetuate, right? Like, the private sector should not be the ones making sure that your children get educated and that you can get healthcare, right? Like, so it feels really important to make clear that the money should be going into governments, and governments need to build infrastructure, like public infrastructure. Like, we're in a pandemic, and we're all so deeply reliant on the internet, yet we don't have publicly available broadband, like, throughout our country, right? Like, and definitely not in New York State. So, I think this is about, how do we feel our society should be governed, and what does our government actually owe people for the tax money that is paid?
Yeah, and I can talk a little bit about Baltimore. And so there's a sort of rationale why for us we are choosing to take the stance around community-based organizations and the direct investment that is needed in those. And it particularly centers around the fact that those organizations are already on the ground doing the work and are already embedded. So that's one sort of rationale and reason. But I think the second and the largest is that we find that our city government, I think that other places, other larger cities like maybe New York and LA, have had better infrastructure. Our city government does not. We're still using technology from from God knows when, at least 50 years ago. We had just had an overtime scandal because like we don't have up-to-date systems to be able to track our police overtime. And so there were people who was getting more than their yearly twice their yearly salary, if not more, in overtime fraud. And when they were at home ironing clothes or like sitting at home watching TVs or taking a trip to Philadelphia, right? And so there is sort of a rationale for us around choosing to be clear around CBOs, and I think that I share Antoinette hesitation around the private sector, particularly the nonprofit industrial complex. And in Baltimore, we worked really hard to make sure that organizations that we're working with had a pretty complex structure so that they would not beholden to the nonprofit industrial complex. And so many of the organizations that we work with, one of them is an organization called B360, but it has so many different arms to it. It has a nonprofit, a for-profit, a LLC, right? They all intertwine in some way. It intersects, and it's because of the fact that we are clear that the nonprofit industrial complex is not going to save us, right? And in fact, oftentimes it funds both sides. But that is the most accessible way in Baltimore in particular that many organizations who are doing dope work can actually receive dollars for that, right? And so for us, it's important to make sure that the city recognizes the work that they're doing. And just like, quite frankly, calling a spade in Baltimore, our people don't trust the government, right? Our people don't trust city agencies. Our people like that's a rarity, right? You can't really point to a city agency in Baltimore where there will be a majority of our city that's like that agency is doing well, from our infrastructure to our transportation to our housing to our police. There is complaint upon complaint. And so we are clear that the people who are trusted are the institutions, are the CBOs that are already embedded in the community. And so to the extent that we can make sure that they're well resourced to do the work that they're already doing, we wanna be able to do that.
Thank you.
Thank
Do we have time for
Yeah.
another one? Okay, so there are a few questions that relate to schools. And so how can we work together to create schools and micro districts that are safe and healing spaces? And another question was about young people's work in this area, about defund reallocation strategies and demands. And that question too brought in the work that's happening in schools around restorative justice, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, so I can just like talk briefly from my vantage point in Baltimore. And so, I think that there's a couple of things, right? One is that the term restorative justice has been co-opted, right, in many spaces. And so I just want to name that I feel a little bit of hesitation around that. But restorative justice, transformative justice, all of that work. I think for us, when it comes to the school system, particularly because we are predominantly Black school district, we are focused on two fronts. One is how to equip young people with their own agency so that they recognize their own agency inside of this work. often I tell people all the time that young people are the baddest organizers that I've ever met, right? They are the ones that are unapologetic and unafraid, and they will take the biggest and boldest risk. And I only know this because I started off as a youth organizer, right? Like that was the nature of my work. And younger me will probably be trying to smack the hell out of older me now for not being as radical as I am. And younger me got arrested a lot for political work. But restorative justice and transformative justice for us in Baltimore centers around young people being able to control those processes, to help design those processes, and to actually implement those processes, right? And I guess as a sort of parallel to that really quickly, I'll just also name the fact that in Baltimore, we are also thinking about reimagining public safety in our city, right? You know, as somebody who started off as a youth organizer, the ultimate truth for us is that while we agree that the government needs to provide a robust quality public education, that isn't being provided. And in fact, many of the barriers that exist in Black districts like Baltimore exists because there's been an intentional concerted effort to make sure that poor people, poor Black people never recognize their own agency and their own transformation, right? And so for us, it's important to make sure that when we talk about agency and like making sure that young people have agency over restorative and transformative justice, we're also talking about making sure that young people have agency over some of the budgets that exist within inside of their school systems as well. And we're also talking about making sure that young people have a participatory role inside of their education beyond just sitting inside of a classroom, right? And for us, that is directly paired with the restorative and transformative justice work, because if people can have power in the decisions that are made on their behalf, they have a little bit more investment, and therefore we reduce some of the conflicts, whatever we want to call them. I hate the term problems, but conflicts that we see arise.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sarah, are we gonna do one more? Or are we good?
Yep. So what system project are we, younger generations, directing people to propose, support, fund, create, unify, or establish? What is the name of the change we're trying to see?
I think that's a question that they should ask themselves, right? But I'll let the panelists please jump in if there are any projects or anything that you think are worthy of highlighting that people can.
And we did have a question about like if someone wants to get started, where to begin, if you want to get involved.
Yeah, I put in the chat a link for the Movement for Black Lives, which is a national coalition of over 150 Black-led and centered organizations from around the country. And M4BL is welcoming more people to come on. Also in the chat were resources for people who want to figure out how to advance the work around defund, who can get additional talking points, messaging, but also how this framing can be applied to where you work. So I'll put it in the chat again, but it should be there. But I'm going to ask the panelists also to share other recommendations.
Yeah, I can't say that we're necessarily directing people to a system or a project, and I think it's so exciting that people want to be connected to something. And one thing that I actually want to direct people to is their own political education and their own transformation, because we're all products of this society, and like the majority of us have not grown up in environments where we understand the way that Lumumba is talking about this vision for safety, and it's work. And I'll tell this very short story. My husband is on Hi Baby, and we were in the supermarket a couple of weeks ago, and we were waiting online, 6 feet away from everybody else. And this guy came in and he was livid. Like he looked like he was gonna break somebody's neck. And he was talking to this young person, maybe like 16, 17 years old. And he was actually screaming at this person. There was someone who worked at the supermarket who was standing by. And he was screaming at him. He was just like, you and your friends, y'all out there throwing eggs at people's car. I got my kids in the car, okay? And he looked like he was gonna kill this kid. And that kid, you know, he's standing there, he's like, it wasn't me, I wasn't doing it. You know, he was holding some eggs in his hand. And me and my husband, we're standing online, we're looking at the situation, and my husband is like, you know, the line's moving. He's like, what are you doing? You're not moving? And I'm like, well, I'm standing here, right? Like, he's like, why? And I'm like, I'm witnessing, right? Like, me standing here makes it a little more difficult for this guy to break this kid's face. Now, does this kid deserve to be held accountable? Yeah, you can't run around throwing eggs at people's car. He got his kids in the car. He just told you that. And like that accountability, he doesn't deserve to get, well, I mean, whatever. You decide what he deserves. But the point is that if we're gonna interrupt harm, it has to be even like when it happens to you, right? Like even when someone does harm to you, are you gonna rely on that carceral way of thinking, of that way of like, this person has to be punished for what they've done? And like the difference between punishment and accountability, you know, it's a very fine line. I think organizers would like to act like it's two completely different things, but it's a very fine line. And I think it takes a lot of internal personal work to really understand what is the line between punishment and accountability, and how do we create systems that don't punish people, but do hold them accountable and create space for repair and love and healing.
Thank you. If we can get the other panelists just to give us some closing remarks on this, that would be great so that we can wrap up.
There's so much to say. This is incredible. I mean, this is really good. And I think everything you said, Anthony, I'm just like, yes, yes, yes to all of that. Couple resources, look at Interrupting Criminalization. Folks like Miriam Kaba have been doing some incredible work, really just leaning into like, yes, we're trying to challenge the state, but let's lean into building what we want. And she's been doing some dope shit. One of the organizations locally with us, the Youth Justice Coalition, is a phenomenal organization that has been organizing young people coming out of the Youth Justice Authority, coming out of the detention centers, coming out of juvenile detention centers. And I just to offer this really briefly, I think one of the things we've been really trying to craft at Justice LA is a comprehensive campaign that understands how multiple lanes intersect with each other. And to the question of young people's leadership, at least in Los Angeles, juvenile detention is ran by the Department of Probation. And it was necessary for us to weaken the Department of Probation, not just so we could get more of our young people out of the juvenile detention, but so we could weaken the Department of Probation's role in every other lane we were fighting, including pretrial detention, including how they're doing reentry work and all those things. And so being able to create a landscape where multiple lanes are talking to each other and mutually enhancing each other was really critical. And I'll drop a link to a YouTube link to kind of a mini docu-series we did. It's a series of episodes, 12 episodes. They're about 10 minutes each that kind of track the multiple lanes we were moving in. And there's a particular one that's focused on young people in schools. But I guess I would just say that, you know, I think that really being willing to grapple with some of the big questions and lean into the rigor of some of the big questions like that are being lifted up here that I think are really rich in this, and like, how are we grappling with the state and the government's role and how much we fund it, and should it be providing us what we need? How much are we leveraging CBOs is a rich question that we have to really dig into. And I think it's so important, for example, but also just, there's just so much. And I just think one of the things I want to leave folks with, that I think part of our recipes for success has been willing to leverage non-reformist reforms for abolitionist purposes, willing to leverage things that didn't necessarily produce abolition, but shifted power towards that abolitionist trajectory. And as long as we can be rigorous and honest and politically honest about what we're doing and our ability to hold those things as we're moving them, I think we can get a long way towards being strategically clear about what we want, but very tactically flexible. I mean, so much can be open to us if we're just clear around how it all fits into the strategic clarity. And so that to me has been one of the gems of this work over the last decade.
Thank you. Thank you, Trey.
Oh my gosh, I don't know. There's so much to say. I think I'm gonna close out with just trying to semi answer and follow up on Angeline's comments with the last question. I mean, I'm going to actually do it with a quote. So I didn't explain that some of my mentors, many of my mentors are Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee members. And so I got politicized and submerged in the teachings and the followings of Ella Baker and of the SNCC students. And one of the SNCC members from the Nashville, Tennessee sit-in movements, which was the second sit-in movements of the 60s, said, Angeline Butler said, change and revolution are created by individuals who react to a given situation, study it, envision a solution, then step forward and set activity in motion, right? And I think that is a fitting response for the question around where do we direct young people, right? Where do we direct people in general? I had a conversation while I was taking a break in Florida with a comrade who was like, Trey, I wonder how mac and cheese got created, right? Like Black people love mac and cheese. Like Black people love mac and cheese. Who thought of putting all of these things together and then you get in mac and cheese, right? But that is so much true to the work that we're up to, right? It doesn't exist, right? And so we need people to begin to do the intense labor of having individuals who are going to step forward, who are going to react to any given situation, right? They're going to react to any given situation, like what happened tonight, like what we constantly see happen in our communities, like what we constantly see happen with police. We need people who are going to study those things, begin to dream, right? Begin to dream and envision a solution, and then step forward to set some amount of activity in motion. And hopefully we'll get something just as great as mac and cheese, right? And if not, we have a theory of change at Organizing Black that we have this thing called theory, practice, theory, right? And it's this idea that if we knew the pathway to liberation today, we would be free right now, right? So nobody knows the pathway to liberation. Nobody really knows what true democracy looks like, right? So we theorize, and then we practice something, right? Hopefully on a smaller scale. I'm not telling y'all to go tomorrow and tell them to burn everything down, but we practice it, we evaluate it, and we theorize it again, right? And we keep going through that same process, right? And then, like I said, hopefully we get something as good as mac and cheese, but if not, we keep trying.
So we're gonna have a mac and cheese democracy revolution. Look, I wanna just ask you all to show some appreciation to the panelists for taking time to come and do this today. Every one of them were wrapped up in responding to the madness that were happening. Most of us were preparing to find out what was happening with Georgia, and then this jumped off. So I appreciate each and every one of you for taking time and really sticking this out and doing this. And so my final remarks really are very simple in that the word unprecedented over the last few months, the last 12, 13 months has been used appropriately, but to death. And I wanted to just make sure that we recognize the historic moment that we are in. And that if we are one of those people who thinks back and says, if I was alive back then, I would have. If I was around when the Panthers did this, I would have. If I was around when Dr. King, whatever, I would have. If I was around when Malcolm, I would have. So I would offer to you all that we're living this moment right now. And whatever you would have done, you're doing it now. And that also offers you the opportunity to change that. So if you are not doing enough, you can change that, you know? And so I ask you to commit yourself to building community. I'm not asking you to join some organization and be on the front line. I'm asking you to build community. I'm asking you to help create tangible shifts in how we relate to each other. I'm asking you to help support the organizations that do exist, but find your lane, commit to doing something to transforming this reality that is unbelievably real before us, and making sure that we have our hands on the wheel of changing the direction of where this is going. So I want to thank you all for joining us. I ask that you join us again next week, where we have a more lively discussion, not more, but equally as lively, where we're talking about the challenges of democracy. And we have two amazing panelists, Nalini Stamp out of the Working Families Party, and Eljoy Williams, who's a political consultant and NAACP from Brooklyn Head. And so please, I welcome you to join us so we will unwrap and discuss some of what we are talking about today and additional things. I'm going to kick it back to you, Sarah, to close out additionally, if that's necessary.
No, you did it all. Thank you. This is so aligned with our approach to a youth development movement that is for social justice and responsive to the needs and desires and dreams of the community. So thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Be safe, y'all.
Thanks, y'all.